The biologic relationship, once it's settled, it's settled. And having access to medication without legal repercussions is key.
In every moment that you're in the methadone system, you also are reminded that you're untrustworthy as a human being. So I think that discrimination sort of orbits around it in a lot of ways. So it's kind of like drugs are bad, and then the prescription drugs, they're still kind of bad.
You know, I think if we're going to show anybody in recovery anything, no matter what pathway they're on, it should be compassion and support, not stigma. Stigma kills people.
Welcome to episode 8 of Debunked, the only Utah podcast combining evidence-based health practices with storytelling to challenge the stereotypes and debunk the myths about harm reduction, opioids, and substance use disorders. I'm Tim Light, and today we will be discussing the myth that methadone and Suboxone are no different than heroin. In this conversation, we're going to talk about the clinical differences between these medications and heroin, and we're going to hear about some of the lived experiences, both good and bad, from people who utilize medication for addiction treatment, or MAT. We're also going to point out why it's important to debunk this myth, and we're going to highlight some MAT resources right here in Utah, particularly in southern Utah. We're also going to chat about the barriers preventing some people from having good, healthy experiences utilizing MAT. But before we jump into this conversation, I wanted to first let our guests introduce themselves. So we'll start with Savannah, go to Garth, and then to Dr. Prest.
So I'm Savannah Eley. I am the Opioid Prevention Specialist at the Southeastern Utah Health Department, and I am actually someone in long-term recovery from an opioid use disorder.
Thank you so much for being with us, Savannah. Savannah's also on our editorial board. I don't think she mentioned that.
I'm Garth Mullins. I'm the executive producer and host of a podcast called Crackdown about the drug war. I live in Vancouver, Canada, and I've been an opioid user for my whole adult life, which is now considerable. So most of that was heroin, and more recently, I've been on methadone.
Garth, thank you so much for being with us. I told Garth before we started that it was an honor to meet him because I look up to him, and our whole team is just really fond of the Crackdown podcast, and we've learned so much from it. It's just been really eye-opening and inspiring, so thank you again for being here.
My name is Prest. I am an addiction psychiatrist, and I work for Moab Regional Hospital. I'm their medical director for mental health and addiction treatment services right now.
Thanks for being here. Again, the myth we are debunking today is methadone and Suboxone are no different than heroin. For those who may not know, methadone and Suboxone are medications used for addiction treatment, or MAT. Although we are going to talk about these medications today, you can learn more about methadone and Suboxone and other medication for addiction treatment in our last episode, episode 7 of Debunked. So I want to hear one or two sentences from each of you about what you think when you hear this myth. So Dr. Prest, do you want to start? And then we'll go to Garth and then Savannah.
The myth of whether methadone and Suboxone are the same as heroin is a really common one. I think I hear it all the time, so it stopped surprising me a long time ago. I think the biggest thing I feel is that it comes from a lot of different places for people. I think when you work in addiction for a while, or you work within addiction circles, you realize that addiction treatment for a really long time has existed on a community level and on a family level, and medicine has had fairly little to do with it until the recent past. And so people have a lot of real life experiences with methadone and now Suboxone, which shape their ideas about how they work. And it has shaped people's perceptions, but it is a myth and most people do really well. So I think my reaction is mostly just to try and offer education and be empathetic though as well to people's real life experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of heroin and a lot of methadone, and I can tell you they're different. They're different in a lot of ways, but the biggest difference is the law. You know, fundamentally, these are both opioids, but one's illegal. One puts you in jail, makes you broke, and can kill you in an overdose crisis right now. The other is prescribed to you by a doctor. But really, at the root of it, they share a lot of the same molecular properties. So the difference is in how society reacts to these things.
When I hear someone say that methadone is no different than heroin, the first thing that comes to my mind is stigma. I think methadone is such a great thing to balance someone's life back out so they can get a job, get their kids back, get a house, all these things that I don't think anybody has the right to judge anybody's pathway to recovery, because every pathway to recovery looks different. And I've watched methadone work for a lot of people do some really amazing things.
Can we talk a little bit more about that stigma? I mean, it's interesting what Garth brought up, because would there be stigma around other substances if they weren't illegal? I mean, I'm sure there would still be stigma, right? As there is around methadone, even though it's legal. I don't know. Those dynamics might change, I guess, but okay, let's focus on the stigma of methadone. What kind of stigma were you talking about, Savannah?
Especially when I was a recovery coach, the stigma that I would see is they're not clean. They're not in recovery because they're still getting high. That was a lot of stigma that I seen. They're not in recovery because they have to wake up every morning between a certain time to go to the methadone clinic and get their methadone. What's the difference between them waking up and going and getting methadone than waking up and going and getting heroin? I mean, so much stigma. There's, and it's sad because even people in recovery have that stigma towards other people that are in recovery on, MAR, medically assisted recovery. They have that stigma towards other people. And I've watched it ruin people's recovery, because someone in recovery who isn't on methadone is telling someone who's on methadone that's not recovery. And I've watched them relapse because of that.
Boy, it's so true, Savannah. I really have felt that in my life. I've been to 12-step programs like NA before, and their official policy is we're for abstinence only, and you can't just replace one drug with another drug. So I think that NA and 12-step programs are big perpetrators of this myth, really. And I know some programs try to reinterpret that NA policy. I believe it's Bulletin 29 or something like this. So I know there's a lot of good people in that mix who are trying to sort it out, but I couldn't find a path through there because they said, no, it's abstinence or nothing. You're still taking methadone. You're still not clean. I'm still dirty. So I really hear you.
And that phrase, not clean, I'm still dirty, is stigmatizing in and of itself, as if, someone who uses drugs is innately dirty or bad or something like that. It's terrible. So this stigma that's out there, it seems like it's really dangerous, because it puts people at risk of overdose. What are your thoughts on this? Can you highlight some of the dangers of perpetuating these types of myths?
So I think it's dangerous for a lot of reasons. I think methadone is a great thing for someone to get on that's, been abusing heroin, because it's going to help them from overdosing. So when you're stigmatizing someone and you're telling them, oh no, you're not clean, it brings someone's something that you've worked for that's so precious. And then, and it is recovery. You bring them down and you send them back for a relapse, and they might not make it back from that. It's just so scary. And, I think if we're going to show anybody in recovery anything, no matter what pathway they're on, it should be compassion and support, not stigma. Stigma kills people. It's so hard. And so many people in addiction and in recovery face stigma.
Yeah, I noticed the stigma too even creeps inside the system. There's a lot of mistrust. You got to take piss tests all the time. You got to line up. You got to get it served through a bulletproof windscreen, or you know what I mean. So in every moment that you're in the methadone system, you also are reminded that you're untrustworthy as a human being. So I think that the discrimination sort of orbits around it in a lot of ways. And yeah, I also think that it's in where you're allowed to have a methadone clinic, whether your neighbors will allow it. Even here, people trying to get their kids back, it can be kind of a mark against you if you're on methadone. There's a lot of ways that it creeps around. So it's kind of like drugs are bad, and then the prescription drugs, they're still kind of bad. I think that's the way society sees it.
Did you say that when you go to get methadone, you have to talk to someone through bulletproof glass? I had no idea about these things. Can you tell us more about that, Garth?
Well, it differs from place to place, right? Methadone programs in Canada are different from the UK and different from the US. But what unites them all is a lack of trust of the drug user. Like, we're just seen as dodgy people. And so it's not like you go into a pharmacy and get your medication in the same way you would any other medication. There's a different parallel path. And sometimes, yeah, that's got security guards and line up out front and bulletproof plexiglass and all that.
I mean, that's not something I think the average person thinks about. Think about someone who's on methadone. I don't know if most people go to that place where it's like, these people are not bad people, yet we're still viewing them in stigmatizing ways and taking away that trust.
And I would also add that some of that is, I mean, every clinic is a little bit different. Like I've worked as a clinician in methadone settings, and my clinic that I've worked in most recently was a pretty friendly place to be. And I think a lot of that depends on the clinic program director and what the culture is that you're trying to establish within those clinics. And some of the reasons why the clinics are set up that way, I think it's not intended to be stigmatizing purely, or I think a lot of it has to do with security. At my clinic, we were held up at knife point. We had the police in and out of our clinic all the time because people were getting robbed in the parking lot of their methadone. And so because it's a controlled substance and it's very powerful medication, and it is something that people still sell illicitly, I think some of that has driven why those clinics are set up that way. I totally agree that it can still be, the end result for the patient is still super stigmatizing, and it doesn't change any of that knowing the reasons, but I did feel like that was worth mentioning.
Yeah, Doc, I think you bring up a good point, that methadone is a scarce commodity, and people do sell it on the street. And in fact, the first lots of times I did methadone, I bought it illegally. And I think most people start methadone diverted, illegally like that, because it can be kind of hard to get on or intimidating, or there can be barriers to get started in a lot of places. So I think part of ending the security issues is stopping making methadone so difficult to obtain. And if it was easier to get, that would lower its value on the street. No one would want to rob anybody for their methadone. It would just be like, ho hum. And also, it's just like, of all the opioids you could get on the street, it's the most unfun to do. So you can see that when people are buying it, trying to get a hold of it, mostly they're trying to get well. They're just trying to find some medicine.
Right, I agree. Same with Suboxone. And yeah, you're totally right. Most people are not going to abuse methadone. Like a lot of harm reduction efforts, I think people get scared off because they're afraid of that, less than 0.5% of people who they will take as evidence that those efforts are not worthwhile, who are going to abuse methadone is the judgment, I think.
People don't want to go line up every day, right? I think a lot of people don't get on it because we call it liquid handcuffs, because there's so many rules. Mm-hmm. And so that's another thing, is people don't want their lives regulated like that. They don't want to be, doing a piss test in front of a camera or whatever like that. So I think there's a lot of that too, is that people just don't want their autonomy in their bodies to be so regulated like that.
Yeah. And I think one of the questions I've often had relates a lot to what you just said, Garth, is that methadone programs are very different structurally than any other clinic setting. And, I think most of my patients would say exactly what you've said, which they feel handcuffed, they feel overly restricted. They wish they had freedom from, the rigmarole day to day of clinic oversight. On the other hand, those clinics offer a level of treatment engagement and requirements that most other clinic settings don't. And when I see most people come into a methadone clinic versus, let's say, someone seeking Suboxone in an office setting, most of those folks are really struggling with the day-to-day at a much more intensive level. They're more likely to be unemployed, more likely to be homeless, more likely to have kind of much larger barriers in their life around success. And so some people, not all, would say that methadone clinics help them develop some limits and structure within their life, and it teaches them something about their own personal accountability. Not for everyone, right? I think we see that with Suboxone, with that population where people get on it, and we give them much more freedom. We give them a week's supply of medication versus a day, right? And some of that is because of the safety of Suboxone compared to methadone. But ultimately, it's a good question. Like, would we see the research outcomes that we see with methadone improving treatment retention and outcomes for patients long term if we didn't have the structure that those clinics offer? I don't know.
Yeah, I was in Portugal and they had a bus, you know, you rock up to the bus and you can get your methadone in 15 minutes if you've never been on it before. They are careful, but it seems that people have devised really good low barrier ways to access methadone. And then there's also a kind of a question of equity of who gets to access Suboxone and who gets to access methadone. And then the final thing about this is these things are not the silver bullet, right? Like for a lot of people, they do not replace heroin. Like I always say, the best substitute for heroin is pharmaceutical heroin. And there have been countries, including my own, where people have trialed and even had programs of just general prescription heroin.
Prescription heroin. Now that phrase might sound surprising to you, maybe even like an oxymoron. You know, how could heroin, an illicit drug that is responsible for overdose deaths, how could that also be something that's prescribed by a physician? Well, you're not wrong to be kind of surprised and confused because this type of program actually doesn't exist in the United States. In fact, it doesn't really exist in many places. But that said, there are a few countries that do have prescription heroin programs, and those programs are discussed today. So I'll say a little bit more about what these programs are to prepare you for today's episode. Prescription heroin is also sometimes called heroin-assisted treatment. This type of program is provided to people who have severe opioid use disorders, which is another term for someone who has a severe opioid addiction. Those individuals in this program are provided with controlled doses of heroin. So instead of them buying heroin off the illicit market or the illegal market, people are supplied with controlled doses of heroin. And this means their heroin was produced in a lab by experts and then is not contaminated or of a strength that's too strong. Because also part of a prescription heroin program is titrating or adjusting the heroin dosage to an individual's physical dependence. So people who have severe opioid use disorders have a high level of physical dependence. So a physician would be able to adjust the heroin prescription to a level that prevents the individual from going through withdrawal, but also does not produce an overdose in that individual. So like I said, in the United States, these sorts of programs are not legal, but I will talk about one country that does have this type of program, which is Switzerland. So Switzerland started a heroin-assisted treatment program in the 1990s. And in this program, it was not such that anyone who wanted to try heroin could just enroll in the program. Instead, this program was pretty carefully controlled and had parameters about who was eligible to be in it. So the program rules included an individual had to be an adult who injected drugs for at least 2 years. The individual also had to have been unsuccessful in trying methadone treatment and buprenorphine treatment. So these are two medications that are used to treat opioid use disorders. Methadone has been around since the 1960s, and buprenorphine is often called by a newer brand name, Suboxone, that maybe some of you have heard of as well. So the individual had to have tried those medications and not been able to be successful in sticking with that treatment. The individual also has to surrender their driver's license, and then they're limited to 3 doses of heroin daily. So the thought process behind this type of program in Switzerland was not just to reduce crime, and you would do that because instead of people buying heroin on the illicit market, they're buying it, from a pharmacy like they would any other prescription. But it also means that their heroin is not contaminated with anything that could be unsafe, and also is of a strength that their body can handle. So some of you may have heard of the term fentanyl, which is an opioid that is much stronger than heroin. Well, that is one of the reasons that people are overdosing in the United States, is that they're buying what they think is heroin, and it ends up that they are buying a much stronger opioid, which is fentanyl. So a prescription heroin program would reduce that risk by providing people with heroin that's made in a lab and the individual knows what's in it. So what was the effect of Switzerland's program? Well, not only did they find that individuals who were in the prescription heroin program were more likely to stay in treatment than when they were trying to be in methadone treatment or buprenorphine treatment, they also found these other outcomes, which were that there was a 60% reduction in felony level crime, an 82% reduction in illicit heroin sales. And that's not really surprising because, like I said, you're not having to buy heroin on the illicit market. If there's a prescription heroin program, you can buy it at your pharmacy. They also found that there was a total elimination of overdose deaths among patients in the program because, again, you're using heroin that's of a controlled level of purity and strength, so you know exactly what's in it, and it's adjusted to your physical dependence by a physician. This is not a program that's available in the United States, but it is sometimes interesting to chat about other programs in other countries just to sort of do a thought experiment. But for our purposes, we're talking today about the myth that methadone is the same as illicit heroin. And that's just frankly not true. Methadone is a prescribed drug. It's overseen by a doctor. An individual has their methadone dosage adjusted by a physician. They're overseen by a physician so that it's safe. So if an individual is using methadone as directed by their physician, this is a safe and good treatment intervention that has been shown in many studies to be very effective. It's not the same as illicit heroin because illicit heroin, not only are you having to involve yourself in illegal activity to get it, but it also is not safe in terms of the ingredients and what's in the drug. You frankly just don't know. Versus if you're taking methadone, you know exactly what's in your drug. A doctor and a nurse were involved in giving it to you. So it's very important that we keep in mind the myth is not true that we're going to hear today, that methadone is not the same as illicit heroin, and methadone is a legitimate treatment for opioid addiction.
I wanted to jump in here real quick to promote episode 16 of Crackdown, which is a moving tribute to one of Crackdown's editorial board members, Dave. And during this episode, it highlights prescription heroin trials that took place in Vancouver. So we encourage everyone to go take a listen. And now back to the conversation.
Instead of having to do illegal criminal things and score off a black market that could kill you, people get diacetylmorphine from the pharmacy and they take it. And the research results are great. But it would mean that we all have to get over all of our ideas about, oh my God, but they're still doing heroin, which is basically just a cousin to the idea, oh my God, they're still doing drugs because of methadone. We talked about it at the beginning of the show. So this question of the myth of the comparison of methadone and heroin, it's got a whole bunch of little planetoid myths orbiting around it too.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with you. And I think that brings up another point about the biologic nature of this disease. And I think there's an argument to be made that opioid use disorder or opioid addiction has some probable differences compared to other types of addiction. You know, when we think about what opioids do to the body and the brain, they're not in essence destructive to the brain tissue in the same way that something like meth or alcohol is. And so, you know, if you're taking pharmaceutical grade heroin day to day, you know, as long as you don't die, there's no real negative outcome to your cognition, your ability to think, your ability to function as an adult person in the world. But I think that's why we see such great stabilization for people's lives when they get on something like methadone or Suboxone, or they have a safe injection site like they do in Canada. So I totally agree. And I think that needs to be given more credit, because when you look at the outcomes for folks on medication alone, methadone or Suboxone alone, oftentimes having therapy, for example, has nothing to do with their outcomes, that it's really this biologic, physiologic stabilization that people are in desperate need of.
I find it's a legal and economic stabilization. That's what changed things in my life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like when I had a good job and I can get, a steady supply of heroin every morning before work, my life was really organized and stable. It's when I couldn't afford it or the supply got messed with by the cops or something like that, then things would fall apart. And I found that same stability getting prescribed methadone. But it's like the social economic instability and criminal justice instability that you get in the black market. That's what I needed stabilization from. I needed to recover from the drug war, not from some relationship that part of my brain had with a molecule I mean, I'm still wired. If I don't take my methadone, if I didn't take it this morning, I'd be throwing up pretty soon. So I'm still wired, but it's just like I don't have all these legal and economic. I don't have cops kicking in my door about it.
You're right. It's not, like you said, the biologic relationship, once it's settled, it's settled. And having access to medication without legal repercussions is key.
As you both were talking, it just reminded me of the structural barriers preventing people from accessing medication for addiction treatment. Last episode, we had Ashanti Moritz on the episode, and she talked about the structural barriers that she faced when she wanted to try methadone. And, similar to Garth, the first several times that she used methadone, it was illicit because she didn't have, insurance. She didn't know how to get it legally, and there were all these hoops that she had to jump through. So it seemed impossible until she could, work something out where she felt like methadone would work for her and that she could trust the system. So these are really great points that you both bring up. We have to take a quick break, but after the break, I want to jump into some of the differences between Suboxone, methadone, and heroin. We've sort of talked about some of those differences, but let's go a little bit more in depth into that discussion. And then I want to hear more about the lived experiences of people who utilize these medications. So we'll be right back. The Debunked podcast is made possible by our members and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration Rural Opioid Technical Assistance Program, offering programs to address barriers of access to rural communities related to opioid use disorder. And Regions Blue Cross Blue Shield of Utah works to transform healthcare from the inside out. We reduce confusion, waste, and red tape for members as we help them navigate the healthcare system. The information on the show is so important, so relevant, and definitely information that more people need to hear. So please take a minute to rate and review the show. There's something about the algorithm. The more reviews, the more Debunked shows up in people's feeds. So rate and review. Thanks. Welcome back to Debunked. The myth that we are debunking today is methadone and Suboxone are no different than heroin. Right now I wanted to talk about the clinical differences between methadone, Suboxone, and heroin, and I wanted to hear about some of the lived experiences, both good and bad, of people who utilize medication for addiction treatment. So, Dr. Prest, can you tell us about the clinical differences between these medications and heroin?
Sure. So methadone is a full opioid agonist, and it blocks the mu receptor completely. There's no potential ceiling effect. I mean, people can develop, tolerance to it over time, and their dose can be, theoretically raised higher and higher. And I think this medication often works better, I would say, on average for folks who have a history of kind of higher potency opioid use, so heroin, fentanyl, but that's not a strict rule. Everybody's individual physiology is really important, and you'll find that some people just respond better. They do better clinically on methadone versus Suboxone or vice versa. Suboxone is a partial opioid agonist, so you'll see there's kind of a plateau effect. And that for that reason, you typically don't continue to raise the dose to better treat cravings, for instance. You might find that there's a clinical peak around 16 milligrams or 24 milligrams maybe, but doses much higher than that typically don't have better clinical outcomes than those lower doses. And heroin, I think, like we were recently talking about, there probably is a role for heroin, although it's a touchy subject in our country, in the United States. But it's a role for treatment that I personally believe in, that using pharmaceutical grade heroin that is free of potentially dangerous additives. Also, there are some people who are treatment refractory to both Suboxone and methadone, and they are better candidates for heroin. Heroin is faster acting, so it goes in and out of your system faster. And so there's peaks and valleys in how people feel. And for those reasons, methadone and Suboxone typically kind of sustain people in how they feel physically day to day better than heroin, because they're longer acting and you don't get so much of that peak and valley. You get more of a rise and then more of a gradual tapering off as the medication leaves the system.
Peaks and valleys, that's a really important term, right? And we call that getting dope sick, or actually getting high, right? That's the valley is the dope sick. And that's really serious, right? Like the most dangerous things I've ever done in my life were to avoid dope sickness. But I also realized I was getting high. I was trying to feel that little touch of euphoria to deal with trauma. And I think that's the thing about methadone and Suboxone. You know, when you look at the companies producing it and the government officials that are regulating it, they don't like to see people feeling any kind of euphoria or any kind of good effects from it. They think that means you're not being prescribed right. It's not right. And it is much harder to actually feel those slight euphoric effects off of methadone and Suboxone. I mean, I've been on methadone for a long time. I don't know about Suboxone, but it's different. But heroin, you feel it, and you would feel it on prescription heroin too. And I think there's a big social problem amongst the people who run the system with people feeling good, right? Like that is not allowed. And it sort of goes back to some kind of, I don't know, like churchy kind of scoldy kind of thing, you know, and I think we have to get over that a little bit. And when I used heroin to feel good, I don't mean like it was a party. I mean, for me, feeling good was just feeling probably normal, like what other people feel. It was just not feeling bad, like terrible, not just dope sick, but also super alienated or traumatized or whatever. And that's kind of one of the things we have to break through.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the opioids, I mean, I don't think people think about them this way, but they're pretty good mood stabilizers. They really help people with depression. And I think there's always been a question in my mind about people's risk and whether or not, because I hear all the time from patients that like, even before I got on opioids altogether, I felt like there was something off with me, something wrong with me. And then I tried opioids for the first time, and suddenly I felt like a person. You know, I hear that all the time. And I think that has to do with these people who end up with opioid use disorders. They really have a different physiologic experience than other people. But it begs the question of, you know, what's brewing in there that we can't put our finger on. We can't see it from a medical perspective. So it's hard to talk about, and it's not very tangible for us right now.
Thank you. Garth, for those who don't know, why is it dangerous right now that there isn't prescription heroin? You talk a lot about the war on drugs, on Crackdown, so what's dangerous about that right now?
Well, you know, you think about prohibition in the US, you know, when alcohol was illegal. And the day before prohibition, everyone was drinking beer. Everyone, you know, you get home from work, you have a beer, whatever, it's fine. Day after prohibition, it's not beer anymore. It's moonshine, right? Because to avoid the cops, they had to make something that was more concentrated, easier to smuggle around, not so high volume, right? So boom, people are making moonshine. And then they got to do it secretly. It's not regulated. There's safety goes out the window. So they're making something that's stronger, but also we don't always know what's in it or if they're doing it right. And so people are going blind and getting sick and dying off of this bootleg moonshine. That's just prohibition. That's just the economics of how it works. There's nothing special about drugs. It's just now it's a different substance that's illegal or a different group of substances. And so the same thing happens, you know. People used to smoke opium 100 years ago, whatever. And then opium became illegal. So they had to make something stronger and more potent and you know, easier to transport and maybe in powder. And then we had to start doing it a more effective and a quicker way, you know, to get a bigger bang for your buck. So then injection starts. And, you know, through the years, you see stronger and stronger heroin. Then you see the introduction of illicit sort of bootleg fentanyl and other stuff comes in, just contaminants that aren't drugs at all come in. Like we've analyzed some drugs here in Vancouver and found household detergent, pig dewormer, brick dust, like a nasty list of stuff that gets in there. That's all because of the rules, right? That's because people are mixing drugs. Distributors are mixing drugs in super unhygienic circumstances, or they're being transported, you know, secretly around the world, or people are trying to sort of buff it up, as they say, sort of step on it and stretch it out a bit. So all of those things, they result now in a huge overdose fatality rate, you know, like all over the US and Canada. I know more than 50 people who've died this way, you know, a lot of them in the last 4 or 5 years. And this is all because of the rules. And at one point in the US and in Canada, we realized that alcohol prohibition was actually just creating way more harms. It was creating deaths. It was creating a huge class of people who were now criminals because they just wanted to have a drink. and it was creating, crazy Al Capone gangster type people. So we're just doing the same thing now. You just have to look at history. You can see the problem. You can also see the solutions.
Thanks for that, Garth. Did you say you know 50 people who have overdosed as a result of these restrictions?
Well, I mean, I don't know what the true number is. I know that when I started making the podcast Crackdown, we were sitting around the table and we were trying to figure out, a bunch of us, how many people we each knew. And I went home and I thought about all the people that I've known through my life in the last few years, and I counted up to 50. And at 50, I stopped because I was experiencing just waves of grief from losing people. And so I called everyone and said, let's not do this exercise. This is too hard. Right. So it's more than 50.
I just feel like we have to stop on that. I think everyone really needs to think about that point. That people are dying and will continue to die if changes are not made, if harm reduction practices are not put into place. It's just really sobering to think about that. Garth, you have a lot of experience with methadone, and you know lots of people with both good and bad experiences with methadone. Can you tell us what it's like to be on methadone versus heroin? And, some of the downfalls that you personally or other people may have experienced using methadone versus heroin?
On heroin, there were times when I was really, really sick, like really terribly dope sick. And, I did things to get money that I probably would not have otherwise done. I had bad interactions with law enforcement. I had trouble getting new syringes sometimes. I spent money that I should have spent on rent. And so I got eviction notices taped on my door. And all that chaos interfered with relationships with people. Like I had partners who said, oh, you're choosing to do heroin instead of choosing to be with me. And that happened more than once. And I have none of that on methadone. And that's all because heroin's illegal and methadone isn't. So on methadone, I just take it every morning and, I don't really notice it. The first few years of being on methadone, I was still using heroin at the same time. So I had to kind of work my way to a place of trust with methadone. And then I got it right. But it's not that way for everybody. Like a lot of people don't make it through those years of doing both. A lot of people's doctors, maybe they don't have such a good relationship. Like I've really nurtured the relationship with my doctor. I've known her for probably 18 years now. In fact, it's the longest relationship with any human I have in my life, and probably one of the most important too. So I've really tried to look out for that relationship. It's just it's like it just lets me go to work and go do my life and not worry about it. The times when you do worry about it is if you have to travel somewhere. You're not supposed to bring it across the border into the US with you, for example. And then the other trouble is if something happens, something goes haywire in the system and your script doesn't come through or something like that, and you can't access it, then you're back to like you got to score off the illegal market or whatever. But mostly it's really good. Up here, a lot of people got switched to a formulation that is less effective. So a lot of people got dope sick throughout the day. I managed to dodge that bullet. But yeah, if you can get on a methadone and get on the right amount that you don't feel dope sick, and you find a way to kind of get a good relationship with your doctor and with the methadone, then it seemed to work out. But I don't have any experience with Suboxone, but that's what I've found with methadone.
So it helped stabilize your life, but you attribute that to methadone being legal versus heroin being illegal. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I had stable periods in my life when I was using heroin every day, right? Like I had white collar jobs where my dealer even knew when I went to work, and so we'd meet in the morning, and I'd get or sometimes if I had enough money, I could put it aside for a few days or whatever like that, and my life was pretty stable then. Rent was getting paid. I was going to work. I had a job. Everything was good. The problems happen when there's a disruption with one of those elements, like if you have to change jobs and you don't have money, or if the drug dealers get busted and then all of a sudden you're scrambling to find a new supply, or the supply dries up or something like that. But yeah, I had periods of stability on heroin. And I know a lot of this sounds pretty radical to to most people. Like there's this overdose crisis, and here's this nutcase from Canada suggesting that we have prescribed heroin. It does sound counterintuitive, right? And that's why I keep referring to this sort of comparison with prohibition of alcohol. But in the context of the drug war, where all this stuff is illegal, methadone is a pretty good compromise. If it wasn't for the discrimination stigma about both heroin and methadone, my most unstable periods of my life would have been cut shorter. It took me a long time to get to methadone, and there is no prescription heroin available for 99% of drug users in Canada and probably 100% in the US. And then I think to doctors, be flexible, be generous to your patients. Know that not all of us are going to be like able to be 100% only using methadone. Like some of us might still be using heroin or something from the street, and just like try to let that slide a little bit, because we'll be using less of it. So it will actually reduce the harm and reduce the risks. To the extent that doctors and people have that room, I recommend they take it. You'll have a better relationship with your patient, and know that your relationship with them will be one of the most important relationships in their life.
Thanks, Garth. Dr. Prest, what are your thoughts on that? On what Garth just said?
I'm on board. I'm an addiction psychiatrist. I do addiction medicines. I love the work I do. I love my patients. I think this is the most fulfilled in my work I've been, because I love working with this group of people. I think the consequences of using heroin, and it does all go back in part to what Garth has said about the legal issues with substances, and that, let's say in an ideal world, buying really pure, safe heroin was something that people had access to. I think obviously the world would look really different when it comes to drug use. I think the other part of this that probably needs to be said is that because we don't live in that ideal world, most of my patients have had a lot of trauma in dealing with their dealers and other people who use. In particular, a lot of my female patients have been terribly victimized. I view the substance use not only as a form of maintenance in the way that Garth has explained his experience when he's had really productive periods on heroin, because of the complications that, drugs are a trade, they're a money-making business. Dealers don't have your best interest at heart. And so it's not just about access. It's become an issue of safety, and it's that drug lifestyle is really damaging to people in a lot of other ways besides withdrawal. So, and the legal parts of it, right? So taking a medication once in the morning, for example, and getting 24 to 36 hours of relief out of it is a really different lifestyle than having to inject or snort or smoke multiple times a day to stay well.
Savannah, what do you think?
So for me, I was addicted to opioids for 10 years of my life. Like Garth said earlier, it wasn't that I was using them to get high. Like for the last while that I was using them, I was mostly using them to maintain, to be able to do normal things in life. I did abuse methadone. It wasn't that I was, it was something to have that would not make me sick. It wasn't my number one choice of an opioid, but it was there when I didn't want to get sick. But one of the great things that I see with methadone is you don't have to detox for 5 to 7 days to get on it. That's huge, because being dope sick off of an opioid is horrible. I mean, you really wish that you would just die. And, I would rather see someone go get on methadone and start balancing out and getting stable than having to detox for 7 days. One of the only downfalls I've seen of methadone in my community, but they are working on this, is that if you go to jail, you can't get dosed. So you're sitting in jail detoxing off of methadone. But they have been working on that. I know that one of the sheriff's offices where I live is starting to dose people, so that everybody's coming together. Like we have a huge problem where I live in Southeast Utah. We're number one in the state of Utah pretty much. And so to see methadone come in, Operation Recovery, and to see our overdose deaths drop is such a huge thing. And Four Corners Behavioral Health has worked so hard on getting this Operation Recovery going, and they have faced so many barriers and so much stigma from, people in the community that think that it's a bad idea, that it's replacing one for another. Another barrier I've seen with somebody on methadone or even Suboxone is not being able to get a job, because if they hurt someone while they're at work, then, they look at them as if they are a liability, I hate to say. And then another barrier that I've seen is, we're such a rural community here in Southeast Utah. Some people can't drive to the methadone clinic. So if they're in Emery County, sometimes they'd have to drive 60 miles, just depending on which town they're in. We're working on the barriers, but the biggest thing is just the stigma that people face. And it's horrible. It's really sad. And it's sad to see even people in recovery stigmatizing somebody that's on methadone versus the Vivitrol shot. It's just very stigmatizing. So we're trying to work through that and educate people, and even educate people in recovery as to why this is still recovery. I always try to explain it to people, and maybe this is a really bad way of explaining it, but if someone's suicidal, the first thing we try to do, or even depressed, is we put them on meds so they can balance out, so they can feel better. Why can't we do that with somebody that's been on an opioid and do that with methadone?
Yeah, I think a lot of the stigma comes in because people just don't know. They don't really get what it's like to be dope sick. They don't really get how an opioid works or how any medication works.
I should probably mention, because Savannah kind of brought this up a little bit, about the ways in which people get onto these medications, and it's probably worth mentioning that methadone is, like she said, much easier to get onto. You don't have to be waiting days to start the medication. You just have to typically want to be in very mild withdrawal. The Suboxone, you do have to be in moderate withdrawal at least, and you typically want to wait somewhere between 15 to 24 hours after your last use of opioids, because Suboxone has really great affinity for the opioid receptor in the brain, and it'll kick off any lingering opioids that are sitting there on the receptor, which will cause what's called precipitated withdrawal, meaning you'll feel even more dope sick than you were afraid of. So you want to wait a little bit. But I did want to mention that when she was talking about waiting 7 days after your last use of opioid, that's naltrexone. That's the opioid antagonist. And we do that because we don't want people to experience withdrawal symptoms either.
Which again, pointing out, not having to wait for methadone is huge, because being dope sick is a terrible experience. Savannah and Garth, you can weigh in on this as well. What's it like to be dope sick?
Well, it's the worst feeling in the world. Anytime I was dope sick, I just remember just wishing I would die, wishing I would die. But then it's also, I need to find something, and you're hunting harder. I mean, you're willing to pay triple for what, your pills are worth or your heroin's worth, just to feel better. And it's like every bone in your body is breaking. You have muscle spasms, you're puking, you have diarrhea. I mean, it's the worst feeling in the world. It's like the flu times 100. Garth, what do you think?
Yeah, for
Was yours
sure.
different?
For sure. No, a lot of that's the same. And when we say the flu, we don't mean a cold that you catch, but actually the flu, like some strain of influenza, which is really serious. And then the other problem is, not only do you get all those symptoms, but the reasons that you're doing heroin or opioids to begin with all come crashing back on you. So if you're trying to use them as a dam to hold back an ocean of trauma and alienation and just like howling terrors from your life, it just overwhelms you, like crashes in on you, and you're desperate to try and put the dam back up, or plug that big leak as fast as you can. So it's very physical, and also very mental, psychological, spiritual. It's like an attack on you on all fronts.
Thank you both for being so vulnerable and candid about that. I hope by hearing your voices, others can be more empathetic toward people who are experiencing withdrawal, or those who are experiencing the plethora of all the things we're talking about right now. Let's talk a bit about the resources for people in Utah. So, Savannah, can you tell us about some of the harm reduction resources that you are aware of where you live?
Yeah, so in Price in Carbon County, we have Operation Recovery, which is an MAT clinic, and that's serving Carbon and Emery right now. They have a bus that'll come pick people up in Emery County or even Carbon County that can't drive. USARA is a great resource too. They just had Community Recovery Center open up here in Price, but Four Corners is also a great resource. I mean, they're one of the best resources to have. And I don't know what's in Moab. Lauren, do you want to talk about Grand County?
Yeah, so I am an addiction psychiatrist down here, so I am pretty much the only one doing MAT right now. We have a couple primary care doctors who have their Suboxone waiver, and I think they carry 1 or 2 patients, but for the most part, it's my clinic. I do outpatient addiction treatment for any type of substance, not just opioid. I also work in collaboration with our Four Corners clinic here in Moab. And then our goal for the coming year, hopefully not too much longer than that, I'm going to be trying to open an opioid treatment program or a methadone clinic down here as well, which would be inclusive of all addictions as well. So I'll hopefully have more news on that to come.
Right now, methadone clinics are basically concentrated on the Wasatch Front, so in Salt Lake and other urban areas. And unfortunately, rural Utahns don't have great access to these resources. So I'm really thankful that you guys are doing what you are doing, Dr. Prest.
It sounds like there's some good things happening there. And what I always say is, if you want better things to happen, like if we want the things to happen that we've been talking about on this show, like that require changed laws and changed social values, that's activism. And when people think about Vancouver, they think, oh, we've got this prescription heroin trial that's gone on for a number of years. We've got safe injection sites, things that people in other parts of the world in the US really want. Well, we got them through activism. We got them often by using civil disobedience and opening our own underground sites first. And I know that the US has a great, proud tradition of that. In fact, the very first new syringe I ever obtained was from a guerrilla needle exchange project in San Francisco that was run underground, and people used to smuggle syringes around in a baby carriage to avoid the police. So that's the tradition of getting things done. And that's the thing that we really need to build in Utah.
The Debunked podcast is made possible by our members and USU's Department of Kinesiology and Health Sciences, committed to educating and serving students and members of both local and extended communities in the fields of kinesiology and health science. Information at khs.usu.edu. And the Tribal and Rural Opioid Initiative of Utah State University, an effort to address opioid use among rural Utahns in the hopes of eliminating myths and promoting health. Information at khs.usu.edu.outreach. Thanks for joining us today on Debunked, the only Utah podcast combining evidence-based health practices with storytelling to debunk the myths about harm reduction, opioids, and substance use disorders. I'm Tim Light, and today we debunked the myth that methadone and Suboxone are no different than heroin. Join us for our special youth episode, episode 9, on September 9th, where we will be debunking the myth, not my kid. On today's episode, we talked about the clinical differences between methadone and Suboxone versus heroin. We heard about lived experiences, both good and bad, from people who utilize medication for addiction treatment. We talked about why it's important to debunk this myth in our communities, and we also highlighted some of the medications for addiction treatment and harm reduction resources, specifically in some rural areas of Utah. We heard about the positives and the negatives regarding these medications, and we also heard about some of the really difficult barriers that people face structurally with our healthcare system, difficulties in access to care, and the very real stigma people face when they utilize methadone and other medications for addiction treatment. You can find links to the resources mentioned in this episode on our social media platforms at DebunckedPod. Speaking of social media, check us out on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at DebunckedPod, or on our website at bit.ly/DebunckedPod. Don't forget to tell all your friends about Debunked and remind them that they can find the show on the podcast app, Spotify, upr.org, and anywhere else they get their podcasts. Debunked is produced in collaboration with Utah Public Radio. Funding for the show comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the Office of Health Equity and Community Engagement, the Utah State University Department of Kinesiology and Health Sciences, and Regions Blue Cross Blue Shield. Our editorial board is Jay Hymas, Adam Baxter, Ashanti Moritz, Savannah Eley, Dr. Sandra Solzer, Dr. Suzanne Prevedel, Dr. Erin Fanning-Madden, Mindy Vincent, Patrick Rizak, Michelle Chapus, Dr. Maren Voss, Dr. Amy Kahn, Tricia Glass, Lloyd Arrive, Hillary Deesh, Jennifer Petrus, and Susie Baker. Debunked is produced by Nick Porras, Shalane Smith Needham, and Friend Weller, with Nick Porras serving as lead producer. Our creative specialist is Autumn Gibbs. Music for today's episode was created by Nick Porras. Our science advisor is Dr. Erin Fanning-Madden, and our program directors are Dr. Sandra Solzer and Dr. Suzanne Prevedel. I'm Tim Light, host and editorial board member.